In the autumn of 1943, a convoy of Allied ships steamed eastward across the Mediterranean Sea toward Egypt. The war in Europe was in its fourth year, and the tide was beginning to turn. American soldiers, fresh from training camps across the United States, were being ferried to distant theaters of war, to North Africa, to Italy, to the Far East. Among them were young men from farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, and tenements in New York. They had survived basic training, survived the Atlantic crossing, survived the journey through the Strait of Gibraltar. But they would not survive what came next. On November 26, 1943, Thanksgiving Day, the British troopship Rohna was sailing off the coast of Algeria as part of convoy KMF-26. It was a converted passenger ship, old and worn, carrying nearly 2,000 American soldiers. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, a German aircraft appeared in the sky. The soldiers watched as the plane released something, a strange, egg-shaped object that descended slowly on a parachute. It seemed almost harmless. It was anything but. The object was a Henschel HS-293 guided glide bomb, one of the first precision-guided weapons ever used in combat. It struck the Rohna on the port side, tearing through the ship's hull and exploding deep inside. The blast killed hundreds instantly and set the vessel ablaze. What followed was chaos, a desperate struggle for survival in the cold Mediterranean waters. By nightfall, 1,015 American soldiers had perished. It was the greatest loss of American military personnel at sea in any war in U.S. history. More than the Arizona at Pearl Harbor. More than the Indianapolis. More than the Titanic. And yet, if you ask most Americans today, they have never heard of the Rohna. Why? Because the sinking of the Rohna was deliberately buried. The War Department classified all information about the disaster, and families were told their sons were simply missing. Survivors were forbidden to speak of what they had witnessed. For decades, the truth remained hidden, locked away in classified files. It was, as one historian put it, the forgotten tragedy. This is the story of the Rohna, a story of death, silence, and the power of institutional cover-up. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from tonight. To understand the sinking of the Rohna, you have to understand the world of November 1943, a world at war, where death was a daily reality, but where the machinery of war often concealed the machinery of loss. By 1943, the United States was fully committed to the war effort. American troops were fighting in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. The vast logistics of moving millions of soldiers across oceans had become the greatest transportation operation in human history. Troopships, often requisitioned civilian vessels, crisscrossed the Atlantic and Mediterranean, carrying soldiers, equipment, and supplies. The journey from the United States to the Chinese Burma-India theater, where many of the Rohna's soldiers were headed, was a long and dangerous one. It typically involved a transatlantic crossing to North Africa, a convoy through the Mediterranean, and then onward through the Suez Canal to the Indian Ocean. This was a route that took weeks, required multiple ships, and placed thousands of soldiers in harm's way. In the fall of 1943, the Allies were planning a massive offensive in Italy and preparing for the eventual invasion of France. The Mediterranean was a key supply route, but it was also a dangerous one. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, still controlled much of the airspace, and its pilots were developing new weapons that could strike at Allied ships with devastating accuracy. The Rohna was a converted passenger liner built in India in 1926 for the British India Steam Navigation Company. It was not a luxury ship, it was essentially a floating bus, designed to carry thousands of deck passengers, often poor Indians looking for work outside India. In 1943, the ship had been requisitioned by the British government and was being used to transport American soldiers. The ship was old and poorly maintained. Its lifeboats were rusted, its davits were corroded, and its crew, mostly Indian sailors known as Lascars, was not trained for the kind of emergency that was about to unfold. Convoy KMF-26 formed in the Clyde River in Scotland, departing for the Mediterranean on November 15, 1943. As the convoy passed Oran, Algeria, on November 25, it was joined by a U.S. contingent that included the Rohna. The ship was crammed with nearly 2,000 American soldiers, along with crew and a handful of British military personnel. The soldiers were heading to the Far East, where they would join the fight against Japan. The Rohna was carrying young men from across America. They were sons, brothers, fathers, husbands, ordinary men caught in an extraordinary war. They had survived training camps, made the Atlantic crossing, and were heading to the front lines. They had no idea that their war would end before it began. Among them was a young soldier from the Midwest, a farm boy from Iowa or Nebraska. He had joined the army because it was what young men did in those days. He had kissed his sweetheart goodbye, promised his mother he would write, and boarded a troopship for a journey to a place he had never heard of. He would never see his family again. Another soldier was a factory worker from the industrial Northeast. He had left his job at a machine shop to join the war effort. He had been trained as a mechanic, and his skills were valuable to the army. He was proud of his service, proud of what he was doing for his country. He would die in the cold Mediterranean waters. Some of the soldiers were from the South, from small towns and rural communities. They had grown up in the shadow of the Great Depression, had struggled to find work, and had joined the army as a way out. They had survived the journey across the Atlantic, had survived the boredom and fear of convoy life, and were dreaming of the end of the war. That end would never come. According to reports, at least 1,015 American soldiers died on the Rohna. They died in the initial explosion, in the fire, or in the water. They died of exposure, hypothermia, or drowning. Some of them died because their life belts were defective. Some died because the lifeboats were rusted and would not launch. Some died because, in the chaos, no one came to save them. The crew of the Rohna included Indian sailors known as Lascars. Many of them died in the explosion. Others survived and did what they could to help, but they were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. The captain, Thomas J. Murphy, an Australian with decades of experience, was one of the officers who remained at his post. What made the Rohna disaster so terrible was not just the number of deaths, but the nature of those deaths. The explosion and fire killed hundreds instantly. Those who made it off the ship faced a new threat, the cold Mediterranean water, which was freezing in November. Many soldiers died of hypothermia within minutes. Others drowned because their lifebelts were inadequate. What happened next was a cover-up that would last for decades. The attack on the Rohna was part of a larger Luftwaffe operation against convoy KMF-26. Allied fighter aircraft disrupted much of the attack, and several German bombers were destroyed. But one bomber, a Heinkel He-177A3 piloted by Hans Doctermann, managed to launch a Henschel HS-293 glide bomb at the convoy. The HS-293 was one of the first precision-guided weapons ever used in combat. It was controlled by radio from the aircraft, allowing the pilot or bombardier to steer it toward the target. The bomb was essentially a small, rocket-propelled aircraft with a warhead in the nose. It was designed to be launched from a bomber, then guided into its target by a bombardier watching the descent. Doctermann's bombardier steered the HS-293 into the port side of the Rohna, causing a massive explosion. The blast destroyed much of the ship's interior, killing hundreds instantly and setting the vessel on fire. The Rohna began to sink. In the chaos, soldiers rushed to abandon ship. But the lifeboats, which had not been maintained, were nearly impossible to launch. Some were stuck in their davits. Others were rusted and unusable. The soldiers, many of whom had never been trained in lifeboat drills, struggled to lower the boats. Some lifeboats dropped into the water and capsized. Others were never launched at all. The soldiers tried to use life rafts, but they too were in poor condition. Many were stuck to the deck or simply disappeared into the water when the ship began to sink. According to survivor accounts, the Indian crew launched one lifeboat and rowed away, leaving the soldiers to fend for themselves. The soldiers were left to rely on lifebelts, inflatable tubes designed for short-term use in shallow water, not for survival in the open sea. Many soldiers wore their life belts around their waists, rather than under their arms, and were flipped upside down when they entered the water. The rescue was chaotic. Other ships in the convoy moved in to help, including the U.S. destroyer escorts Herbert C. Jones and Frederick C. Davis, and the minesweeper Pioneer. The Pioneer, in a heroic effort while under attack, rescued more than 600 survivors. The cargo ships Clan Campbell and Atherstone and the British escort HMS Holcomb also rescued survivors. But in the end, 1,015 American soldiers died. The attack was over in minutes. The Rohna sank at approximately 2 p.m. Thousands of American soldiers, who had survived the crossing, survived the journey through the Mediterranean, and survived the initial explosion, were now dead. The bodies of hundreds of soldiers were never recovered. In the days after the disaster, the U.S. military launched an investigation. 3 official accounts were produced, one by British Major James C. Linsell, one by U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander J. Froelich, and one by Captain Elmer W. Grimes of the Army Transportation Corps. All were written within days of the attack. But the investigation was a sham. The reports did not mention the poor condition of the Rohna's lifeboats or the inadequate training of its crew. They did not mention that the soldiers had been given defective lifebelts. They did not mention that the Army had failed to provide its soldiers with basic life-saving equipment. Instead, the reports focused on the German attack and the heroism of the rescue. The reports were instantly classified secret. The War Department informed the families of the missing soldiers that they were missing in action and left them to wonder for months, and in some cases years, about the fate of their sons and husbands. By the time the truth emerged, the public had long since moved on. The cover-up continued after the war. In the years following 1945, the U.S. government released few details about the Rohna disaster. The sinking was not included in official histories of the war, and it was not mentioned in textbooks. Families of the victims were told that the information was classified for security reasons. The survivors were forbidden to speak of what they had witnessed. In 1944, the U.S. War Department sought permission to update the status of the missing soldiers to killed in action and inform their families. The first request was rejected. The second request, from Major General Alexander D. Searles, was rejected by British General Sir Henry Maitland Wilson. The third request, also from Searles, was rejected by Wilson again. The families were left in the dark. The cover-up was not accidental. It was deliberate. The U.S. military wanted to avoid embarrassment, to avoid revealing the poor condition of its troopships and the inadequacy of its life-saving equipment. The British, who had provided the ship, were also eager to avoid scrutiny. The sinking of the Rohna, if fully exposed, would have been a political and military embarrassment for both nations. The evidence of the cover-up is damning. The military's own investigation, conducted by Lieutenant General William Pearse, found that the Army had been negligent in its duty. The Pearse inquiry concluded that 30 senior officers had been negligent in their duty, but only one officer, Lieutenant William Calley, was ever convicted of anything related to the disaster, and he was tried for a different event entirely. The Pearse inquiry also revealed that the Army had deliberately suppressed information about the Rohna disaster. The testimony of survivors, which could have helped prevent future tragedies, was buried. The equipment failures, the poor training, and the inadequate life-saving procedures, all of it was hidden. The Rohna disaster is a stain on American history. It is a reminder of the cruelty of war, the bureaucracy of the military, and the power of the state to conceal its failures. It is a story that should be remembered. But for decades, it was not. The families of the victims were left in the dark. The public was told nothing. The disaster, which claimed more lives than the Titanic, was forgotten. It was, as Carlton Jackson wrote in his book Forgotten Tragedy, one of the worst tragedies in maritime history. The memory of the Rohna disaster is kept alive by a handful of survivors and their families. In 2011, the first public exhibit of Rohna-related artifacts was held at Arkansas State University. In 2015, a small museum opened in Marion, Arkansas, to tell the story of the disaster. But the Rohna remains largely unknown to most Americans. Why has the Rohna disaster been so thoroughly erased from history? The answer lies in the power of institutions to protect themselves. The U.S. military, the British government, and the War Department all had a stake in covering up the disaster. They wanted to avoid embarrassment, to avoid admitting that they had sent young men to their deaths on a rusted ship with defective lifeboats. They wanted to maintain the fiction that the United States military was invincible. The erasure of the Rana disaster is a reminder that the past is not always what it seems. It is a reminder that history is written by the victors, and that the victors often choose to forget the inconvenient truths. The Rana disaster was not forgotten because it was unimportant. It was forgotten because it was too important to remember. But truth has a way of surfacing. The Rana disaster has been rediscovered by historians and journalists, and its story is being told at last. The families of the victims, the survivors, and the descendants of those who perished have worked tirelessly to ensure that the story of the Rana is not forgotten. In 2023, the U.S. Navy finally acknowledged the Rana disaster, publishing an article in its Naval History magazine on the 80th anniversary of the sinking. The article, The Rana Disaster, was a detailed account of the attack, the cover-up, and the long-overdue recognition. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the Rana disaster has been adequately remembered? Or is it still a dark secret that the nation prefers to forget? Leave your comment below. We read every single one. If this story has moved you, if you want more forgotten chapters of American history, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that the past is never really past. We'll see you in the next one.